of notoriety. But just round the corner is a dispute of even greater magnitude. In fact, it's the most famous trial in art history.
The furore began with an explosive painting, this ambitious attempt by Whistler to show a firework bursting into life against a night sky, and part of the ongoing Nocturne series. The work's called Nocturne, Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket. The painting was reviewed by the most eminent art critic of the day, John Ruskin, himself a painter, but a better writer, historian and polemicist, who described Whistler's work, on sale for 200 guineas, as a pot of paint flung in the public's face. Whistler was outraged and sued for libel, and the case was heard over 2 days in a courtroom packed with press and public. Aside from the drama and notoriety of the event, various issues were at stake, not least Whistler's belief that art could and should exist for its own sake. His description of the Nocturne, not as a view of the river or as part of London, but, quote, an arrangement of line and form and colour, anticipated the whole development of abstract painting in the 20th century. But the crux of the case was Ruskin's obsession with the finished quality of works of art and the idea of cost equalling labour. Under questioning from the Attorney General, no less, Whistler was asked, "Did you take much time to paint the Nocturne in black and gold? How soon did you knock it off?" To which he replied sardonically, "Oh, I knocked one off possibly in a couple of days. 1 day to do the work, another to finish it." "The labour of 2 days, is that for which you asked 200 guineas?" asked the Attorney General. "No," replied Whistler, "I ask it for the knowledge I've gained in the work of a lifetime," for which he was roundly applauded. In the end, Whistler won the case, but was humiliated by damages of a farthing. Whistler felt vindicated, but he was bankrupt, thanks in part to the trial. So he decided to leave London and head to Venice. Just as he'd done with his pictures of the River Thames, so Whistler was picking up the mantle of J.M.W. Turner in going to Venice. But he ventured much further afield, going off the Grand Canal and into the watery labyrinth of back streets and canals. "I've learnt to know," Whistler wrote, "a Venice in Venice that others have never perceived." True or not, on his return to London in 1881, the Venetian paintings were a considerable commercial success. Whistler's travels became an important footnote in the history of English painting when in December 1883 he came here, to the Cornish fishing town of St Ives. In a way, he was following in Turner's footsteps and became the second in an illustrious line of English artists who settled in the place and made it one of the most significant artist colonies in Europe, culminating 100 years later in the building of the Tate St Ives. At the age of 51, Whistler showed no signs of slowing down. A colleague, Menpes, recalled, "Whistler rose at cockcrow and seemed always full of the most untiring energy, screaming reproaches, instructions, taunts and commands at the somnolent followers." But there were also signs that the painter was mellowing, at least emotionally, when he became involved with the wife of an architect who just died. Beatrice Godwin, who sat for this painting in 1886, was herself a painter, and the experience seemed to bring the two together. 2 years later, Whistler and Beatrice married.
In 1894, Charles Freer, the American railroad magnate, who eventually acquired the Peacock Room, asked Whistler to paint him a spring picture. And Whistler's response, ironically in homage to the Peacock Room, because the first part of the title was Harmony in Blue and Gold, was this work of a nude young girl, the Little Blue Girl, as it's subtitled. And if you look at this work now, it doesn't really have that spring-like feel, although a young adolescent girl on the verge of womanhood was an age-old symbol for the idea of spring. But something happens in between Whistler starting this work and his eventual completion of it. When he began the picture, Whistler was in one of the happier periods of his life. His marriage to Beatrice was strong. But within a year or so, she was diagnosed as having cancer. And Whistler paints and draws and makes lithographs of a series of very moving images, the best of which is called By the Balcony, and shows his wife lying in bed at the room in the Savoy where they were staying, with an image of London that Whistler had painted so frequently throughout his life seeming to flicker off and almost disappear into the distance. And on the 10th of May, 1896, Beatrice dies, and Whistler is consumed, overwhelmed by grief, and eventually writes a letter to Freer apologising for not being in touch with him, explaining what has happened, and saying that he feels unable to convey his grief through anything other than his canvases. And it's in that context, I think, that we should look at this work, because the figure of the girl seems to be almost on the verge of being overwhelmed by this bluey-grey cape. And in a way, it's an eloquent image of the idea of grief. That's one way in which you can see it. And it's only after Whistler's death that Freer finally acquires the work that he requested as an image of springtime, but I think whose vision now is much more autumnal.
Whistler's last years were slightly listless, and it's certainly fair to say he never recovered from Beatrice's death. He sold his Parisian house and studio and continued to travel as he'd always done, venturing as far afield as Rome, Gibraltar and North Africa. There were numerous honours bestowed on him, and various celebratory exhibitions too, but he painted little of consequence, and finally, on the 17th of July 1903, Whistler died in London, a few days after his 69th birthday. In his will, Whistler stipulated that none of the work that he owned should ever find a place in an English art gallery. And yet, in spite of his eventual contempt for the English, mainly as a result of the trial, he was perhaps the man most responsible for the development of modern art in England, particularly abstract painting. There are those who take Whistler's art and personality a little too much at face value, stressing his obsession with good taste and aesthetic appearance. And there's no doubt that the fame and notoriety he achieved in his lifetime continues to obscure the fact that, along with his delicate and refined technique, Whistler was an experimental artist with a constantly questioning vision as to what painting was and what it might become.